I'm 109 years old. I know how that sounds. Most people don't make it this far with their teeth, let alone their memories. And every morning when I open my eyes and know where I am, I whisper thank you, not to anyone in particular, just thank you. Because at this age, waking up with your mind still intact feels like being handed something fragile and rare. I have buried almost everyone who once knew me as a young woman, my husband, my sister, friends who used to sit at my kitchen table and argue about politics and pie recipes. I am the last witness to whole rooms full of laughter. Sometimes that's the hardest part. Not death itself, just being the only one left who remembers. People ask me how I've avoided dementia, as if I have a secret recipe tucked inside an old cookbook. I don't. I'm not a scientist. I was a school teacher for 42 years. I raised 2 children. I burned dinners. I paid bills late. I worried too much. But I've had 109 years to watch what happens to people, to see who keeps their mind and who slowly loses it. And I can tell you what I've learned, not as advice, just as a woman who has lived long enough to notice patterns. I think it begins with staying curious long after you think you're done becoming someone. When I was in my 20s, I thought life was about building something solid, a career, a marriage, a house with a fence that didn't lean. I married at 24. He was steady and kind. We didn't have much money, but we had plans. Plans feel like oxygen when you're young. In my 30s and 40s, I was busy, too busy probably, teaching all day, cooking at night, folding laundry while listening to the radio. I told myself I'd slow down later. I'd read the books stacked on my nightstand later. I'd take piano lessons later. There was always a later. That word is dangerous. Later. I watched some of my friends shrink during those years. They stopped reading, stopped trying new things. They said they were too tired, and maybe they were. Life can wring you out like a wet cloth. But I made a small rule for myself at 38. I would learn one new thing every year. Some years it was small. How to make bread without a recipe. How to identify birds by their songs. One year I learned basic Spanish from cassette tapes in my car. I was terrible at it, but I kept going. I didn't know it then, but I think that habit saved me. Your brain, I've come to believe, doesn't like being treated like a finished product. It wants to stretch. It wants to be confused sometimes. Confusion isn't the enemy, stagnation is. But staying curious wasn't the only thing. In my 50s, I almost became someone I wouldn't have liked very much. My children had left for college. My husband was working longer hours. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. I could feel myself turning inward, watching too much television, eating dinner on the couch, letting days blur. That's when loneliness first introduced herself to me properly. Not as a sharp pain, more like a fog. You don't notice it right away. You just stop calling people. You assume they're busy. You assume there will be another chance. I forced myself to host Sunday dinners once a month, even when I didn't feel like it, even when the roast was dry and the conversation awkward. People came, then they kept coming. New friends brought other friends. Noise returned to my house. Conversation, I think, is medicine, I have seen people decline after they stop talking to others regularly. When the only voice they hear is their own thoughts, something begins to dim. We are not meant to live inside our own heads all the time. We need friction, laughter, disagreement, stories we've heard before. My husband died when I was 72, a heart attack in the garden. One minute he was complaining about the tomatoes. The next minute he was gone. Grief does something strange to the mind. It can sharpen it or dull it. For a year, I walked around in a haze. I would forget where I put my keys, forget whether I had eaten lunch. I was afraid. I thought this is how it starts. But I realized something important. I was not losing my mind. I was losing my will to engage with it. So I made another decision. I joined a community choir at 73. My voice shook. I couldn't always hit the notes, but I showed up every week. Memorizing lyrics at that age was harder than I expected. I had to practice. I had to pay attention. Singing pulled me back into my body, into the present moment. It demanded breath and memory at the same time. I have always moved my body, even when it hurt, not in heroic ways, just walks, stretching, gardening. At 90, I was still pulling weeds myself, slowly, carefully, but moving. I've seen neighbors sit down in their recliners at 75 and simply stay there. They say their knees hurt, their backs ache. Of course they do. Mine does too. But when you stop moving, the world shrinks to the size of your living room, and I think the mind shrinks with it. There's another thing people don't like to hear. Bitterness ages the brain. I had reasons to be bitter. My father was cold. My first child was born premature and nearly died. I lost my sister to cancer at 61. Life handed me enough sorrow to justify a permanent frown. But every time I replayed those injuries in my mind, I felt something tighten, like I was rehearsing pain so I wouldn't forget it. Around 80, I decided I was tired of carrying old arguments, tired of mentally scolding people who had been dead for decades. I began practicing something simple. When a painful memory surfaced, I would let it sit for a moment. Then I would deliberately recall a different detail from that time. A kindness, a joke, a small mercy. It didn't erase the hurt, but it balanced it. I think dementia isn't just about biology. It's also about what grooves you carve into your thoughts over years. If you carve only resentment, that's the path your mind knows how to travel. The turning point for me came at 94. A dear friend of mine, Margaret, began to fade. She had been sharp as a tack her whole life. Crossword puzzles in ink, political debates that left younger people dizzy. Then one afternoon she looked at me and called me by her sister's name. I laughed it off at first, but over the next year she drifted further away. She forgot our shared stories, forgot her own birthday. Eventually she forgot how to swallow. I sat by her bedside during her last weeks. She would stare at the ceiling, eyes open but far away. It frightened me more than death ever had. After she passed, I went home and sat at my kitchen table. I was 95 then. I remember thinking, if my mind goes, I want to know I did everything I could. So I became deliberate. I read every day, not just novels I could glide through, hard books, history, science, things that forced me to pause and reread paragraphs. I wrote letters by hand to my grandchildren, not emails, letters. I described memories in detail so I would have to retrieve them carefully. I started keeping a small notebook where I recorded what I learned each week. A new word, a fact about stars, a recipe adjustment. It wasn't impressive, but it kept me reaching. And I paid attention to sleep, to food, to water, simple things. I noticed that when I neglected those, my thoughts grew fuzzy. But I need to tell you something honest. Even now, at 109, I misplace my glasses. I walk into a room and forget why I'm there. I repeat stories. That is normal. Aging is not a failure. The difference, I think, is that I never surrendered my sense of participation. I never decided I was done. There were years I was tired, years I felt invisible, years I wondered what the point was of learning another poem when so many people I loved were already gone. But each time I chose to stay in conversation with the world. That's what it comes down to. Conversation with books, with people, with music, with your own changing body. If you isolate long enough, the mind grows quiet in ways that aren't peaceful. Now I sit in a small room with photographs covering the walls. I outlived my son. That is a pain I will never fully explain. I outlived most of my friends. The phone rings less often, but I still wake up curious. I still wonder what the weather will do, what new word I might learn. Whether the young nurse who visits me will tell me about her boyfriend. I don't fear dementia the way I once did. If it comes, it comes. I have already had more years of clarity than I ever expected. But if you're asking me how to avoid it as much as anyone can, I would say this. Don't treat your mind like an attic where you store old boxes and shut the door. Open the windows, rearrange the furniture, invite people in, argue gently, forgive often, move your body even when it protests, learn something that makes you feel foolish, and don't assume you'll start tomorrow. I assumed that once, about piano lessons, about trips I never took with my husband because we were too busy. Later can slip through your fingers without making a sound. At 109, I can't fix what I postponed. I can't go back and sit longer at the dinner table when my children were small. I can't ask my husband one more question about his childhood, but I can still choose how I spend this afternoon. I can read, I can stretch, I can call someone, I can pay attention. If this meant something to you, don't wait until you're counting birthdays in the triple digits to start protecting the small daily habits that keep you awake inside your own life. One day, if you're lucky, you'll wake up old, very old, and you'll open your eyes and know exactly where you are. There is no greater gift than that.